Welcome everyone to this Physicists Coalition for Nuclear Threat Reduction special webinar. My name is Zia Mian. I'm one of the co-founders of the Physicists Coalition and a member of its steering committee. I'm also the co-chair of the Princeton University Program on Science and Global Security. So the Physicists Coalition, which was founded in 2019, works to reduce the threats from nuclear weapons by mobilizing advocacy within the physical sciences communities in the United States and internationally. Given the civilization-ending potential of the use of nuclear weapons, we advocate for substantive changes in nuclear arsenals, force postures, and declaratory policies. We also call for fulfillment of the long-standing international obligation to achieve nuclear disarmament. And you can read more about us at physicistcoalition.org. And if you're not a member and would like to join, you can find information on how to join the coalition on that site. So today, thank you all for joining our webinar, which takes up a very fascinating topic, which is US government assessments of nuclear war and nuclear terrorism risks. And we're going to be thinking about this through the findings of a recent National Academy of Sciences study on this topic. So the Committee on Risk Analysis Methods for Nuclear War and Nuclear Terrorism was established and managed by the National Academies of Sciences, Medicine, and Engineering in response to a congressional mandate to independently explore US government methods for assessing nuclear war and nuclear terrorism risks and how these assessments are used to develop strategy and policy. It produced 3 reports, which you can find on the website of the National Academies. Our presenters today are the study director of the Committee on Risk Analysis Methods for Nuclear War and Nuclear Terrorism, Dr. Jenny Heimberg, who is the acting director of the Committee on International Security and Arms Control for the National Academies. Our second speaker is one of the co-chairs of the Committee on Risk Analysis Methods that produced this report, Dr. Elizabeth Pate-Cornell, who is also professor in the Department of Management Science and Engineering at Stanford University. And our third presenter today is the Honorable William Ostendorf, the other co-chair of the Committee on Risk Analysis Methods for Nuclear War and Terrorism that produced this study. And he's the former principal deputy administrator of the US National Nuclear Security Administration. The reason that we're having this webinar is because this committee produced a very, very important set of findings about how risk assessment methods can be used to understand nuclear war and nuclear terrorism risks, how these assessments are used to develop strategy and policy, and to help us understand and policymakers understand some of the current limitations and gaps. So in today's webinars, the co-chairs and the director of this study will discuss how these nuclear war and terrorism assessments are generated. And including in this, we've asked them in particular to look at how nuclear war risk analyses may be useful in helping us think about the scope of pathways and outcomes that lead to a nuclear war and possible weaknesses in how this process is currently undertaken. Also looking at how US Strategic Command generates a daily risk of strategic deterrence failure assessment for each of the nuclear armed adversaries of the United States. And finally, the current assessments of the consequences of nuclear explosions resulting from deterrence failures and how they could and include other kinds of effects that currently are not fully explored in some of these assessments. So with that, let me hand over the webinar to Dr. Heimberg as our first presenter. So Jenny, please.
Well, first I would like to thank you, Zia, for inviting us to talk to you about the reports that we produced. I also want to thank the audience for joining us today or for watching this video and for your interest in this subject. Even though we've concluded our committee and it's disbanded, the reports, as Zia mentioned, are out and available, and I think our hope is that they continue this conversation. So thanks again for inviting us and for your interest. I wanted to start off, Chris, if you could show the slides. I wanted to start off, first of all, talking about what the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine is. I do this because when I briefed an Academy study once, I actually wasn't aware of what the Academies was, and so it's an opportunity to explain a little bit. Can you go to the next slide, Chris? The Academies is actually, despite its name and what often is assumed, we are not part of the US government. We're a nonprofit, nonpartisan institution that was signed into law by Abraham Lincoln to provide independent, objective, evidence-based advice to the federal government to help develop policy based on objective and high quality scientific assessment. Next slide, please. There's two arms of the National Academies. One is the honorific arm, where we have now 3 different academies. Initially, it was just the National Academy of Sciences, then the National Academy of Engineering, and then the National Academy of Medicine. These are honorific academies in which different scientists are elected by their peers to be members. Appropriately, I show one of our most famous members, a physicist. Here's Albert Einstein. This statue is close to the NAS building in Washington, D.C., and you should come to visit it if you're ever in D.C. So that's one arm of the academies. The other arm is what's referred to often as the National Research Council. It's where studies like the ones that the co-chairs and the committee and I worked on, we produce reports. We also have a number of different ways of convening different experts. We have workshops. We have different ways of writing white papers and just providing this independent scientific advice to the U.S. government, but also more widely now to other sponsors and institutions that would like to tap into the approaches that we have for sharing this information. Next slide, please. So specifically today, I wanted to talk about the origin story, if you will, of our methods for assessing risks of nuclear war and nuclear terrorism. Next slide, please. As you mentioned, this is a congressional mandate, and it's actually how some of our studies that come to the academies are originated. There are members of Congress that would like clarity from the national academies before they move forward with bills or voting on things. And so this one directed the Department of Defense to contract with us to issue 2 reports, one an unclassified report, including findings, potentially recommendations regarding the use of analytical methods to assess risks of nuclear terrorism and nuclear war. And then at the conclusion of the study, another of that first study, we would expand and look at potentially classified, having access to classified information, produce a second report. And you can scan this code here. It'll take you to the NDAA language for this. Next slide, please. Our studies are governed by our statement of tasks. So if the NDAA directed the Department of Defense to contract with us, and we worked with them to establish a specific set of tasks that would address the congressional language, but would also be useful to the Department of Defense and other agencies. Phase 1 was I referenced it in the previous slide, the unclassified assessment of to identify risks associated with nuclear war and nuclear terrorism, to do a prior literature search and summarize what approaches for assessing risks for terrorism and war were, and then assess the role that qualitative and non-quantitative analytical methods can play in estimating such risks, including limitations of such analysis. And Dr. Pate Cornell will talk about that in the next session of this talk. Identify and examine the assumptions about nuclear risks that underlie national security and strategy in the United States. And there's a caveat here, and that task 4 might be revisited during the classified data collection portion of our study. And finally, task 5 was to describe the consequences or impacts of the methods and assumptions that have been or could be used in developing nuclear security strategy for the United States. So during phase 2, we also were able to revisit the first tasks to see if access to classified information and those discussions led us to make any changes to what we had recommended and highlighted in the first phase report. A bit of a spoiler here is that we found that there were no changes needed in our phase 2 report. Next slide, please. I wanted to recognize these committee members. You will hear from the co-chairs shortly. I mentioned Dr. Pate Cornell, but also Bill Ostendorf was the other co-chair. This list of members indicates it's a full list of members that participated both in phase 1 and phase 2. You'll see that some members in phase 1 did not participate in phase 2. And with the smaller set of committee members for phase 2, we identified a couple gaps and added Henry Willis and Philip Zellico to our roster for phase 2 of the study to make sure that we had the right mix of experts to address our statement of task. Next slide, please. So here are both phase 1 and phase 2 reports. As mentioned, we actually have 3 reports on our website, and let me spend a little time just explaining that. The one on the left-hand side is our phase 1 report. And again, you can scan this to have access to it. And the one on the right is our phase 2 report. And we had 2 versions of our phase 2 report. The first one came out shortly after the report exited review and an initial classification analysis done by the Department of Defense. And we released that to the public as soon as we could. There was a version of the report that was controlled unclassified information, which we did not want to release to the public. Obviously, there's restrictions to that. But that longer report went through a more detailed security review, and the outcome of that was that more of our initial phase 2 report was now determined to be publicly releasable. And so we went through the extra steps and extra time to release a second phase 2 report, which is why there's 2 phase 2 reports. If I were you, I would just go to the later one. We call it, I think, the expanded abbreviated report, a CUI report, that has more information in it than the first phase 2 report. I think that's it for my slides. I encourage you to take a look at these. All of our reports on the National Academies websites are available for free download, and we'd be happy to answer any questions, Zia, that you might have right now, but otherwise we'd be happy to turn this over to Elizabeth.
Thank you, Jenny. I think that that was very clear, and the reports are available on the National Academy site, and Jenny flagged the QR codes for getting them. We also will make direct links to the PDFs of the reports available when we release the recording of this webinar on our website, also to make it easy for everyone, along with the full bios of our very distinguished presenters today. So let me now ask Elizabeth Pate Cornell, please, to make her remarks. Elizabeth, please.
Yes. Good morning. It's a pleasure to be here and to tell you about the work that I have done, and sharing with great pleasure this committee with Bill Ostendorf and working with Jenny. What we have done is to look at the methods, the ways of looking at the risk, rather than computing it, which will change every time. I'm going to tell you about the methods of risk analysis, which is what I teach at Stanford, mostly to graduate students. And there are two kinds of methods I'm going to discuss. The qualitative, which is not really my focus, and I do not believe give you the same perspective as the quantitative one. So I would like the next, okay. So what's the objective of this? Is to design a method that include uncertainties. And that's the problem, to discuss uncertainties in a quantitative or qualitative way to address the risk of a nuclear conflict or a nuclear terrorist attack. So what that means, the scenarios. What are the scenarios by which it could happen? What are the initiating events of these scenarios? Who might start a nuclear attack against the US and under what circumstances? What can be the US response, given the commanders, the weapons, the adversaries, and the nature of the conflict? And what are the chances of continuing combat or a stop for a truce? And so we use a probabilistic risk analysis when we do the quantitative part. And some in the qualitative also discuss probability, but in a different way. And what actions can we take to slow down the possible escalation? And what can be the spectrum of the possible outcomes? Next slide, please. Okay, so let me talk about risk analysis under uncertainty. First, we need to think about the risks ahead of time and before the stuff happens. Don't neglect the unlikely. So that means don't tell me, oh, that we do not need to look into it because it's not going to happen. Yes, we need to look at the whole spectrum of possibilities we can think about. We need to be unbiased. We do not want to have to do a risk analysis where someone is trying to push his or her fears. We need to address all the relevant outcomes, again, including the less likely. We need to characterize and communicate the uncertainties. And again, we have two ways of doing it, quantitative versus qualitative. So, risk analysis is based on scenarios, probabilities that are more than statistics, and dependencies among variables, outcomes and dynamics. I often hear, oh, we cannot do a risk analysis because we don't have statistics. Yes, when we do a risk analysis for things that have not happened, which is the most important, you don't have statistics, but there are other ways of doing it, which is what we're going to discuss. Next. Next slide. Okay. So, to do an integrated study of risk reduction, we need integration across the domains, military, economics, all kinds of things. Integration across regions, Asia versus the homeland. Integration across the spectrum of conflicts before combat. Integration decisions in the US government, that means diplomacy, intelligence, economic tools to secure assistance, and force posture decisions. And we need also to integrate with allies and partners, that is, sharing of risks and priorities with them ahead of time, discussing it ahead of time to make decisions with them. Next, please. Okay, qualitative analysis. It's easy to generate. It's easier, I would say, to generate. It's a description of the risk severity and perhaps the frequencies with words, small risk, infrequent, tolerable, etc. The source is experts, expert opinions, on a whole risk or on a scenario. The advantage is that it's easy to gather from decision makers, experts or anybody. Now, there are some issues with the qualitative approach. First, the problem of expert choices and the effect on the risk assessment. By the way, that one we also have in the quantitative part. The problem of mixing facts and values, which is really what we are trying not to do in risk analysis. There are the facts, and then what is it in terms of risk that I can accept or not accept? And that sometimes enters the risk analysis. The difficulties in rational support of risk comparison with a qualitative approach is very difficult to compare some of the risks. Sometimes it's obvious, but often it's not. And then the problems of assessing and describing dependencies among risk factors, which is again much more difficult in a qualitative analysis. Next. And therefore, we go to the quantitative risk analysis. What is it? It means quantification of the possible outcomes, and that's often done, whether there is an analysis of the risk with the uncertainties or not. But then the quantification of uncertainties with probabilities, statistics if they exist, which is not necessarily the case, stochastic processes, and that is seldom done. That means over time, what might happen. So we use Bayesian probability, which is again the way people feel about things, but in a very structured way. What's very important is to separate facts and values in assessing the probabilities. The scenario of several factors, A, B given A, C given A and B, are the important parts of the quantification. So we need the opinions of different experts for different factors, often less of a problem with expert biases. So here are some problems with the quantitative approach, and few people use probability, is gathering and using numbers, the probabilities, from experts independent of their preferences, and sometimes they find it very difficult, and consistency of opinions. Next, please. What are the analytical tools that we use? For risk analysis, functional diagrams. What does that mean? What influences what? What factors influence what factors? We use fault trees. We use influence diagrams. And what are those? Diagrams that show the dependencies among factors in Bayesian networks. And then stochastic processes to look at the evolution of uncertain events that we can anticipate, and Markov processes. For decision analysis, using Bayesian risk analysis, we use decision trees and event trees. We use Markov decision processes. Again, those are uncertainties over time and how the probability of state 1 influence the probability of state 2, state 3, state 4, etc. And then partially observable Markov decision processes. Next. What are the data sources? Well, sometimes we have actual data and statistics, for example, of behaviors. We have test data, for example, the result of past but incomplete scenarios. We have surrogate data, and what that means is failures in similar scenarios. We have history and social science models, and then finally, expert opinions when we don't have anything else. We often do a probabilistic risk analysis because we do not have relevant statistics. So the question is, what information do we need versus the information that we may have already? And what are the results? The probability of failure, or partial failure or success, a probability distribution of the outcomes and losses, and again, the whole distribution. We want to look at all the outcomes, including the least likely, the most likely, the worst, the best, etc. Next. Next slide. Okay, what are the challenges? First, the model formulation. And because we need to integrate hardware, software, and human management factors. That is, the performance of each of those and the failures of each of those. The choice of experts. And we need to spend time with them. We need to have experts who are independent. We need to have a group of experts that present different types of views of the problem. And again, we need to spend time with them to understand them. Gathering information free of preferences and focus on the facts and not what you want the result to look like. Communicating the results and explaining probability and Bayesian reasoning to people who have not seen probability before. And what's important is that probabilistic risk analysis are most useful, but sometimes, often, go against deep-seated deterministic thinking. And that's the difficulty of risk analysis, is to actually give you a good probabilistic analysis that represent the uncertainties, as opposed to deterministic thinking that may represent either what you think is going to happen no matter what, and what you would like to see happen. And I think that's the end of my story. And I'll be happy to take questions.
No, thank you, Elizabeth. So I think we'll move on to Bill's presentation and have the questions for both Jenny and you and Bill at the end of this. And because I don't see any questions that are being lined up just on the theory and practice of risk assessment that you've so clearly laid out here. So Bill, over to you, please.
Thanks, Zia, and thank you for the invitation for Jenny and Elizabeth and myself to participate today. I'm going to speculate that maybe one or more of the attendees for today's webinar may have been motivated to attend after watching Netflix's House of Dynamite. So I just wanted to throw that out on the table as something, if you haven't seen it, it's kind of thought-provoking. I'm going to try to build off Elizabeth's remarks and provide a few comments to address what the committee had found in the context of the use of risk analysis methods by the U.S. government agencies and departments we were dealing with. Next slide, please. Okay, this slide shows the different organizations that the committee heard from with respect to nuclear war risk analysis. Again, this is nuclear war. Years ago, I had a chance to work, I was a legal counsel and staff director for strategic forces for House Armed Services. I can recall back 20-something years ago, talking to STRATCOM at that time about nuclear war and missile defense in particular. I had a chance a few years ago to spend a few years serving on the Intelligence Community Studies Board at the National Academies. So there's been a lot of different organizations in the government that have been involved with nuclear war risk. We'll come more later on when we talk about ROSDEF, risk of strategic deterrence failure, to kind of see how's that dealt with by STRATCOM. Let's go to the next slide, please, Chris. These are the groups that we heard from with respect to nuclear terrorism. And I'd like to just real quick at this point, at a very high level, draw a distinction between nuclear war and nuclear terrorism. The risk of nuclear war is often expressed by considering nuclear armed adversaries' decision calculus. We'll talk more about that later on. While the risk of nuclear terrorism is more often focused on the availability of nuclear materials that might be used by a terrorist organization. Next slide, please. All right, we're going to start off with the Defense Threat Reduction Agency. That's an organization within the Department of Defense whose mission is to deter strategic attacks against the U.S. and its allies and reduce and counter weapons of mass destruction, whether they be chemical, biological, radiological, or nuclear. And at a high level, since we're focused on nuclear terrorism today, at a high level, the two nuclear terrorism threats are basically considered to be either improvised nuclear devices, which undergo a nuclear explosion, think of atomic bomb explosion, and radiological dirty devices, RDDs, or dirty bombs, which have explosions but not nuclear based and can spread contamination through radioactive material used to make those devices. All right, the committee had several briefings from DTRA, and we saw that the current modeling by DTRA is limited to the prompt military effects, especially detonation or blast, and some fallout effects. But the DTRA's analysis does not currently extend to broader and longer term effects. We saw as a conclusion from the committee's work that there's a need to better understand other physical effects. Think about fire, damage in modern urban environments, electromagnetic pulse effects, EMP, and so on. We also saw a need to assess and estimate the psychological, societal, and political consequences of nuclear weapons use. Those are not currently modeled by DTRA. So we spent some time thinking about this and saying, here's what's being done by DTRA currently. Now, DTRA can only go model those effects and do those consequence studies that they're directed to do by the Department of Defense. So there are some limits based on their organization, but they did appear to have some capability in this area that has not yet been utilized. Next slide, please. I'm going to talk about the risk of strategic deterrence failure. I'm going to use the acronym ROSDEF. And this is a technique or a method that we were briefed on in 2022 at Stratcom out in Nebraska. And as I mentioned in an earlier slide, this concept of methodology to assess the risk of nuclear war looks at the adversary decision calculus. It's a method used to assess an adversary's goals, psychology, cultural perspective, information, and reasoning. This is used by not only Stratcom, but also by the Joint Staff. And this ROSDEF method can guide U.S. actions to maximize deterrence. We did see in the committee's findings that there is one weakness that needed to be addressed, and that was it does not really use scenario-based methods, which can provide greater insight into interactive behavior between the United States and a threatening country. Going back to Elizabeth's talk on qualitative tools, up front, ROSDEF is a qualitative tool. It's designed to guide integrated defense deterrence planning and decision-making. It's important for us to communicate to this group today that ROSDEF was one of the few examples that we saw as a committee of where information collection activities were being conducted in a way that would guide decision-making. Again, qualitative decision-making based on geopolitical risk, et cetera, by Stratcom. When we were at Stratcom a little over 2 years ago, again, the Ukraine-Russia conflict was well underway. We found that Stratcom was using ROSDEF to brief the Secretary of Defense, the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and at times the President during that conflict. We also noted there was some discussion at Stratcom about trying to incorporate in the future quantitative methods to add to the qualitative approach. We're not sure where this stands right now. At the time of the writing of this report, it was not clear that this ROSDEF assessment tool for risk of nuclear war was widely understood across the U.S. government. There is no evidence at that time that it was accepted as a formal tool for the U.S. government. Next slide, please. Now I'm going to talk about nuclear terrorism risk analysis. Again, Elizabeth has already talked about PRA, probabilistic risk assessment. I want to note one thing that is important, and I'm going to use a very simple example of how PRA can help look at a very simple nuclear terrorism challenge. Let's suppose you have a nuclear facility that has special nuclear material that's defined by the Department of Energy as material that can be used in a nuclear weapon, most commonly associated with plutonium, uranium-233, and enriched uranium-235. Let's suppose that those materials are contained in a facility, and one looks, how do you provide security for that facility? Well, that security calculus is based on many different components. It could involve gates, motion detectors, guards, canines, guns with guards, could include the incorporation of drones. So by looking at the overall security measures that could be used or employed to protect against a terrorist threat to this facility, you can use PRA to determine the effectiveness of a given component, let's say the benefit and value of motion detectors versus drones for surveillance. So we better understand, in many cases, the security calculus for a given nuclear terrorism scenario by breaking it down into its PRA components. I'll also note that the Department of Energy and Nuclear Regulatory Commission both use a graded materials consequence approach such that materials of greater use, let's say as an IND, improvised nuclear device, would receive more significant security protection than might material that could only be used in a dirty bomb or an RDD. I'll note here that for the terrorism analysis done by DHS, as well as by NNSA and NRC, there are 3 categories of terrorist organizations: international, domestic, and small group or lone actors. I think, as many of you know, that after 9/11, Department of Energy worked with the U.S. government and NRC to promulgate a classified design basis threat document, which talks specifically about the requirements to safeguard nuclear material at nuclear facilities under the control of the Department of Energy or regulated by the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. Next slide, please. This is my last slide. Just going to let you read this for a moment. It's talking about intelligence-informed leadership judgment. That's a common approach used by decision makers to guide nuclear policy and decisions. One aspect of this is one can use worst-case scenarios or most likely scenarios. And it's important that irrespective of which methodology is used, that the risk analysis group clearly identify what assumptions have been used for the scenario development. I think that many of you have experience looking at expert elicitation, expert judgment. That also comes into play here with many of the intelligence-informed risk analogies, risk methods being used to assess whether it be the risk of nuclear war or nuclear terrorism. So Zia, I'm going to stop right there as my last slide and turn it back over to you.
Thank you, Bill. And if I can ask Elizabeth and Jenny also to please turn on their cameras, we can open up the webinar now to discussions and questions from all of the participants.
Thank you.
Yeah. So I see that we have Joshua Handler with the first question. So Josh, please, and do identify yourself. Josh, are you there? Oh, Josh Handler says he put his hand up by mistake. So I see Paul Slovic has raised his hand. So Paul, please go ahead. Paul? Okay, so we're obviously having.
Paul's a member of the committee, so it's great to hear him. Hopefully you can connect, Paul. We'd love to hear from you.
Okay, so for some reason we're not getting Paul's question to come through either. So can you write down your questions in the chat, please, since we seem to be having a problem here. In the meantime, we have a question in the chat from Ward Wilson, which I will read out. It says, one of the problems with evaluating the risks of nuclear war is that nuclear weapons were used only twice during 1 week against one type of target in a war with a single nation with its own specific type of government and cultures of thinking. So we have only 2 data points. How is it possible to accurately estimate what mistakes leaders will take in response to a nuclear attack with so few data points to work with?
It's a question to me.
Yes, please, Elizabeth.
Okay, so let me say that we do all the time risk analysis when we have no experience. We have to go down to the possible scenarios. So we look at what could happen that hasn't happened before, and that might, and we go to experts to help us look at all the elements, all the elements of the scenarios. And we go with different experts for different parts of the scenario. And we compute the probability for things, again, that have not happened. I have done a lot of studies of things that had never happened. For example, in space systems, what are the probabilities of failure of space systems that have not been launched yet? So you have to go back to the way the space system works to do that. This is a similar case. We have to look at scenarios and the spectrum of scenarios to do that.
Thank you. So we have a question from William Faulkner, who's a PhD student in science policy, that risk analysis must be premised on the risks of what exactly? And so he asks, what are the selected endpoints that you use for nuclear war? So Bill, do you want to take that one?
Let me take a quick stab at this and then let Bill and Elizabeth follow up. What we talk about in the report is that risk analysis of nuclear war, nuclear terrorism you can take different bites of the apple, if you will. There can be different risk analyses for the types of questions that you're asking about. One such thing could be, I have 3 ways to spend this money to reduce the risk of, nuclear war. Can you prioritize which of these different specific programs might be best? That's different than assessing the overall risk of nuclear war, which is not something that this committee did. But we did talk about the different questions, just like William has suggested, that would provide boundary conditions over what the analysis would cover. Elizabeth and Bill, feel free to expand on that.
Thank you, Jenny. I'll add one brief point here, and this was not in the report, so I'm talking about just a very common example used in the open press is, what is the motivation in North Korea for Kim Jong-un to potentially use nuclear weapons? And most people would suggest if he was threatened that his regime would be overthrown. And so you're looking at the survival of that regime being part of the adversary decision calculus for that particular country. And that's driven by lots of factors as far as stability of the economy, health of the people, relations with other countries, et cetera, et cetera. Just one example is you could take that off in many different directions, but that's just one very simple one.
This is a very good example. And what I would like to point out is that if we look, for example, at, let's say, Russia, we're going to have to look at the spectrum of possible scenarios and what can be the motivations, under what circumstances, who is going to be making the decision in order to be able to follow up. And then for each of those, look at these scenarios, their probabilities, and their possible consequences. So again, in the method I was talking about, we need to look at the whole spectrum of scenarios. What is it that these people are trying to get?
Yeah, thank you. So Josh Handler did put down a question in the chat. So he says, what role do regional experts play in risk analysis and understanding Russian, Chinese, Iranian, or North Korean intentions? Since your study reviews the period back to the 1950s, did their role and influence change over time? That referring to the role of regional expertise. So would you like to take that on?
I would say I'll start off and ask Elizabeth and Jenny to add in their comments. I think certainly the regional expertise has always been deemed to be important to understand the dynamics of what's happening in a given region. I know that during my time period, I've carried nuclear weapons on 3 of the 6 submarines I served on. During the Cold War, there is a very significant focus on the Soviet Union and what was happening politically in that country with its leadership changes and so forth and so on. And the U.S. government heavily relied upon the intelligence community, Department of State, the interagencies, private citizens, various networks to really understand what was happening in Moscow and how to interpret whatever was happening and what that might mean for the United States. I'll ask Elizabeth and Jenny to add in.
Well, I would have to say that our study does not try to actually implement the model, but to describe the model. And Bill is right. If we tried to implement this model, we would have to look at the whole spectrum of possibilities. And we have to look back to see what has happened, how people have reacted, etc., in order to be able to anticipate what might happen in the future.
One other comment that I would add to this is that expert elicitation is something that we understand a lot better now in terms of biases than we did in the 1950s. So I think that would be one difference that we would that one would incorporate when using expert elicitation for modeling nuclear risks.
Yeah, thank you. So with that, let me ask a question that follows on from this. We know firsthand from the late Daniel Ellsberg in his book, The Doomsday Machine, where he talked about meeting with members of the executive committee that was put in place by President Kennedy to deal with the crisis created by the positioning of Soviet nuclear weapons in Cuba, that even though all the members of the executive committee were presented with exactly the same information from the US government's capacities to gather information at that time, the assessment of what was the risk of nuclear war ranged from fractions of 0.1% to, he cites, 1 in 1,000, all the way up to President Kennedy saying that in his judgment, the risk was between 30% and 50%. So I'm just curious that how, given that when people actually were in a situation to have to make risk assessments, you get people with enormous experience in dealing with understanding risks and issues of nuclear war, coming up with orders of magnitude difference in their assessment of the risk of nuclear war. How do you factor that into that if Strategic Command produces one risk of strategic deterrence failure, that colleagues in the State Department or the intelligence services or somebody else presented with exactly the same information may not come up with very, very different assessments? I mean, how did you think about that set of relationships?
Yeah, I'll be happy to answer this one because that's exactly why we do that quantitative risk analysis, look at decomposing the event into the scenarios. If I ask people their global opinion, I'll get wet fingers in the wind and they will give you how they feel about it. It's not completely solved by taking the different scenarios and decomposing them, but that helps enormously. So why is it that you think it's 1 in 300? Okay, let's talk about that. Why do you think it's 1 in 10? So what are the events that might happen? And let's look not only at their probabilities, but the dependencies. And let's look at all the possible rare events that might occur. But decomposing the system is really what allows you to avoid this kind of spectrum of wet fingers in the wind.
Bill, did you want to add to that in any way?
I'll just comment that I've not read the book, so I don't have. I've read a different book on the Cuban Missile Crisis that I used when I was teaching political science, not that one. I'd only comment that I think there's value in having all the different perspectives, even though different, they may be differing opinions, different assessments, brought before the decision-making body to air those out and to basically ensure that dissenting, disagreeing positions are made known and understood by everybody so that the final decision maker is making a well-informed decision. Does not mean that he or she as a president has to have achieved a consensus of all the cabinet level, other folks that might be around the table, but understanding the different positions is critical.
Yeah, thank you. I see that Paul Slovic has raised his hand again. So Paul, do you want to weigh in here?
I was able to unmute. I haven't been able to use my controls, either the chat or the audio. But anyway, I guess I can now. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you, Paul.
First,
Thank you.
it's nice to see Jenny and Bill and Elizabeth again. Great to see you. So as they know, I have a pessimistic view about the ability of the human mind to adequately assess the consequences of any major nuclear war, because we have not a lot of risk assessment, as Elizabeth has demonstrated, is based on having events that take place or experience with events that help us assess the probabilities and have a sense of how to value the consequences. Fortunately, except for the World War II use, we haven't had such experience with nuclear war. We get a glimpse of this from some of the movies. House of Dynamite didn't take us right into an actual war, but so I would say that the human mind does not adequately understand how to comprehend the consequences of a major nuclear war, which are vast. I mean, the motivation for using nuclear weapons would likely come from short-term benefits, which are appreciated, like, oh, we need to win this war, which is going badly for us, and we're losing military lives. We're going to lose other things. We want to win this war. And this is like the motivation that Vladimir Putin might have if he was, if the war goes really, really bad in Ukraine, he could well be motivated to use nuclear wars to save his regime and his dreams of a greater Russia. We can understand the short-term benefits. We cannot understand and comprehend the vast societal or civilizational or environmental consequences of major nuclear use. And if we cannot comprehend those, how can we? I would say that we don't have methods to value those and to compare them to the benefits. And if you can't comprehend and value the consequences, I would say that there is no way to defend that the short-term benefits outweigh those long-term costs. I think it would be very hard to show that these weapons should be used in any major way. And I wonder if you could comment on that.
Thank you, Paul. Bill, please.
Yeah, Paul, thanks for that comment again. I'm so glad you're here today. So hope you're doing well. One of the findings we had, one of the conclusions we had in our report was that the longer term consequences, psychological, economic, political, societal, those consequences for long term do need to be evaluated. And so I think the conclusion of the report is aligned very much with the spirit of your comments. And that's something that we'll wait and see if the Defense Threat Reduction Agency undertakes that effort going forward.
Thank you.
Just a quick comment, and this relates again to Bill's comment about Stratcom and the use of this Rostov method, where they propose to value these societal and broader consequences. And I've had the pleasure of speaking to Stratcom on 2 occasions and briefing them on these on the various aspects of the psychological and social consequences, and they listen very politely and seem to appreciate it, but they never follow up. My guess is that they are not taking seriously that element in the definition of what Rostov is supposed to do. That there seems to be a lack of respect for the decision-making process, and again, with regard to the risk assessment project, which was very well done, I think it was framed as doing risk assessments, which then would presumably be used for decision making. But I would argue that the decision making aspect of nuclear weapons management is not appreciated and not assessed and studied. And I think that comes through in the movie that Bill mentioned, The House of Dynamite, which apparently they talked to a lot of people who are on the inside. And what you see is a president who is unprepared to have to make a decision in the scenario that took place, has only a few minutes to decide. There isn't adequate pre-planning, pre-assessment of what to do in that type of both out of the blue crisis. And so decision making is not respected. So we have all these agencies that was Bill pointed to that have risk assessment in their mandates in some way. But for what? Risk assessment has to then be fed into decision making, and decision making is not being appreciated and managed properly in terms of pre-planning and thinking about how you value the benefits and costs. It seems to be shocking, the neglect of the decision making process that risk assessment is supposed to inform.
Thank you, Paul. So if I can,
Perhaps I could
please.
perhaps I could add something. I totally agree with Paul. And what's important is to look at the link between the risk analysis and the decision-making process. Risk analysis being an input to the decision-making process. And it's important that it be well understood and formulated in such a way that it can be used.
Thank you, Elizabeth. So we have a question from Ed Lyman. Ed, do you want to ask your question, please? Okay, so let me read out Ed Lyman's question. So he asks, did the committee evaluate the quantitative vulnerability assessment models that are being used to modify security plans at both military and civilian nuclear facilities, and in particular, the validation or lack of validation of such models and their impacts on overall uncertainty?
I think Jenny out and Elizabeth, I'll take that.
Yep.
I think the short answer is no, we did not.
Okay, no, thank
But
you.
I understand where Ed's coming from, the spirit of his question.
Yep, okay, thank you.
It is not.
So, so we have a question from Shanice Forte, which says, much of this risk assessment structure seems to overlap with environmental, chemical, radiation exposure, and health risk assessment. What kind of tactics, political systems thinking, scenario setting, or Bayesian can help reduce bias at the front and back end with this issue of the need to separate values and facts?
I'll take this one.
Question for Elizabeth.
Yes. The question is how you formulate the problem. And what you have to do is to separate the scenarios, or to decompose the scenarios into the different elements of it. And look very carefully at the experts that you ask for each of these, the parts of the scenarios. And when I say the experts, I mean all the sources of information and the dependencies. And at the end of the day, what you get is a result that is not for sure. We do the best we can with what we have. We do the best we can with the information that we can gather, and we put it together as carefully and as, how can I say, as carefully as we can.
Thank you. So I see Hans Christensen has raised his hand. So Hans, do you want to try asking your question?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you, Hans. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you very much for a fascinating presentation, and really for doing this groundbreaking study. This is incredible to read. I still have to dive in details, but so far so good. So I haven't had a chance to go through it in all the details, so to speak. So apologies if this is a stupid question, but how did you, or how does the system, so to speak, decide when a scenario is possible or likely? I mean, obviously we can hypothesize about it, but is there sort of a threshold, a barrier, certain factors that have to be checked before it becomes relevant? And if I can just throw in a second one, you're saying that the DoD hierarchy precludes the inclusion of risks of minor conflicts in ROSDEF. That surprised me, given all the focus there has been on, limited nuclear scenario after the Cold War. So what is a minor conflict in that context? Thank you.
Thank you, Hans. Jenny, do you want to take that?
In terms of the scenario selection, I actually think that Elizabeth would be best suited to answer that question. In terms of minor conflict for ROSDIF and the exclusion of that, is my understanding, and Bill can help me, is that this is really looking at our strategic adversaries and trying to understand their decision calculus, and that maybe not enough resources available to look at all different adversaries there. But again, Elizabeth and Bill would be able to answer those questions in more detail. Thanks, Zia.
So Elizabeth?
My attempt is to make sure that I have the complete set of scenarios, and in particular those that are supposed to be rare, might or may not happen, but have to be considered because you would be surprised how black swans happen, and people are surprised. So really, the job is to try to gather all the scenarios you can and all the events that you can think of, and that's the limitation. In order to be able to assess the risks that you're looking at. And not say, oh, I think it's too unlikely. Well, it may be unlikely, but it happens. And black swans happen. And I remember that that tempest in 91, I believe, on the East Coast, where we had the three different storms that converged, and it was a terrible, terrible experience.
Let me comment, if I can, to kind of just add to what Jenny and Elizabeth said. The ROSDEP process is up front looking at nuclear armed adversaries. I think a minor conflict involving a nuclear armed adversary would trigger ROSDEP consideration. So, for instance, India and Pakistan both have nuclear weapons. Border conflicts they've had in the Kashmir region over many years is something that is on decision makers' minds. So that is, though it may be a minor tussle at the border that has implications for escalation that could result in triggering a nuclear attack. With respect to the Ukraine Russia conflict, again, our report was put out and the research was done, written during the previous administration. So information is not necessarily up to date as to what the current administration may be doing. But the prior administration was looking at the Treasury Department to provide input to their decision makers for ROSDEF. So, for instance, the impact of U.S. sanctions involving China or India purchasing oil from Russia, those are kinds of examples of things that are not military conflict, but are potentially significant economic drivers that are part of the calculus that could be used by decision makers. So I'll stop right there.
Thank you, Bill. We have a second follow-on question from Josh Handler. So Josh, do you want to ask your question? No. Okay, so I'll read it out from the chat again. It says that on page 33 of the Phase 1 report, it states that the U.S. Strategic Command's Essentials of Post-Cold War Deterrence report argues that calculated ambiguity worked to deter Saddam Hussein. But Josh asks that after examining captured Iraqi records, independent scholars argued that Saddam Hussein never intended to use chemical weapons against US troops on the battlefield. Instead, he saw them as a strategic deterrent. And the question is, did you find other instances of differences between expert analysis and strategic command's analysis of these kinds of situations about the risk of use of nuclear weapons and for various reasons? And because different reasons have different policy implications for US forces and deterrence efforts.
That's a great question. I'm going to tell you my short answer. We did not, as a committee, delve into the facts associated with those kinds of scenarios. Our focus rather was on the methodologies, the risk analysis methods that were being used, not with trying to ensure that we did a fact-finding investigation as to who said what.
Okay. Thank you. But it does offer for an interesting kind of academic study if the data becomes available to say, this is what the analysis was, and this is what we now find looking in more detail after the event of what actually transpired and how the analysis actually holds up in the face of new data. Yeah.
I'll add here, Zia, this is now 20 years ago when I was on the House Armed Services Committee staff as legal counsel. We had a hearing on weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, and looking at the information and intelligence that supported the Bush administration's goal of going into Iraq to counter WMD. And so that investigation was pretty extensive. Those hearings, different committees in Congress were well known. So those are the kinds of forum, I think, in which the question that's being asked today, one might get an answer to that question there.
Okay, thank you. I see a question from Stephen Young. Stephen, do you want to ask your question?
Sure. Thanks, Zia. Hi, Stephen Young with the Unix Concerned Scientists. A very interesting panel. Bill, we haven't talked in a long time since you're back in an essay. I
Good
don't
to see you,
believe.
Stephen.
Yeah. So really, actually, this question mostly for you, Bill, but happy to have anyone talk about this. I mean, to me, I read the phase one report very closely, and basically, you found it very challenging to have a real way to do this clearly. Like this is very clearly a very hard problem. There's no easy answer. You can make some approximations. You can say this is a research area, but there's no answer. Like this is the risk. We just don't know because there's not enough examples. The data is not enough there. To me, that's deeply troubling. Our security is based upon nuclear deterrence, but we don't know how likely nuclear war is. Is it 1 in 10? Is it 1 in 10,000? That question to me matters. And to me, it's actually a fundamental question of should we rely on our security based on a system when we don't know how likely that awful outcome is? To me, the argument is no, we should not. But Bill, I'd just love your thoughts on that question. Is that something that troubles you at all? Or it works fine. I'm not worried about how likely it might be. It still works. It might be a personal question.
Yeah. Let me comment very briefly, Stephen. I appreciate your thoughtful query for us. I'm going to be careful to distinguish my personal opinion from the committee's opinion here. I'll just say the committee found, as did I, that the ROSDEF process at Stratcom was a very concrete, commendable step in the direction you're talking about to get some type of an approach that could be used for decision makers to make the best decision possible. And the ROSDEF, though not perfect and still it's an evolving process, and we can't tell you where it is right now because our information was found a little over 2 years ago. We think that's a step in the right direction to have some type of a deep-rooted thought, interdisciplinary, cross-agency collection of data and analysis. It may not rise to the level of achieving the goal you're talking about in a quick time period, but we at least as a committee thought that was a very concrete, positive step that we were pleased to see. Elizabeth? Jenny?
Yes. What we were asking to do is to present a method. We were not asked to talk about the implementation and what it means today, what it will mean in 10 years, etc. So I understand your question, Steve. We are not doing an implementation. The one who had a lot of experience in that field is Bill Estendorf, of course. But again, we were not trying to assess the probability of a conflict, of a nuclear conflict. Now, if you ask me to implement the model, I could try to do it piece by piece, but I would not give you what is the answer. And for sure, it will be a probability and a probability distribution.
Jenny?
I would like to just add one thing to the comments of Elizabeth and Bill, and that is whether the absolute value of, and this is again more my opinion, a little bit of my opinion here is, what is the absolute value of the overall risk of nuclear war versus the trends of what something like a ROSDIF might be showing us, whether the trends are going up in terms of some of the concerning indicators or whether they're going down. And so it's these are methods to collect and integrate that information and give us, at least in the case of ROSDIF, sort of a regular update on that. So which is perhaps more actionable output for decision makers to see what decisions they make and the impacts it has.
Thank you. So if I can, there's a question in the chat from Patricia Lewis. Patricia, do you want to ask your question? Okay, I'll just read out the question. So Patricia says, I like the approach of uncertainties. In some ways, this may be a better approach than probabilities. And so the problem, she says, is that in many cultures, politicians and other decision makers do not feel comfortable with uncertainties. And so did the committee think about this question of cultural bias with regard to uncertainties? So Elizabeth, Bill, Jenny?
No, yes, I can answer this one. No, the committee did not do that. And the probability is used to quantify, to characterize the uncertainties. You can express the uncertainties in words. I think, I believe, perhaps, etc. But what we try to do when we quantify the uncertainties is to be more precise and more than that, so that we can combine these risks together, or the events together, and we can also rank the risk. Which one is greater than the other? Sometimes it's obvious without any kind of quantification, that's fine. Sometimes it's not. And it's not when you have dependencies that make the risk of one option much bigger than what you thought.
Thank you. So we have a question in the chat from Jackie Cabasso, who asks that the speakers have stressed the need for impartial, I think Elizabeth used the word independent, unbiased, neutral experts. How is adherence to these requirements compatible with the fact that people are human beings dealing with a subject as emotionally volatile as nuclear war, which speaks also to Paul Slovik's earlier comment. But I'd also like to add the question here about, given that so much of the information and analysis takes place inside governmental bodies, which are socialized either as military institutions or intelligence institutions or diplomatic institutions, how did the committee think about this question of impartiality, independence, and institutional bias and constraints, and being normalized into specific ways of thinking, and how that deals with this question of the independence of judgment that you mentioned?
I'll make a comment, then others will chime in. I think we realize that it's important for the assumptions that any particular risk analysis individual makes, for those to be clearly stated and subject to debate and give and take back and forth with other risk analysis analysts. I have seen at times my prior government experience where, in my opinion, National Security Council staff does a pretty good job of trying to take into account outside views before rendering a recommendation to leadership. And I say that with respect to either Republican or Democratic administrations. So I'll stop with that.
I'll mention the last slide that Bill presented talked about intelligence-informed decision-making. And there, I think the committee in the report echoes this, was a little bit uncomfortable about using intelligence informed decision-making by itself. There might be other ways to bring in alternative views or more objective quantitative ways to balance that.
And to add to Jenny's comment, I mean, the use of red teams throughout the government to get to some of these types of scenarios and to provide an external critique based on people that have some experience in those areas, I think overall those can be pretty effective to help eliminate, or I don't say eliminate completely, but reduce the bias you're talking about.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, there's an old saying that one is familiar with, that where you stand depends on where you sit. And so, it's and in these kinds of situations, it becomes very interesting to think about how we can encourage people to, stand, perhaps to sit in more places, and perhaps to see if that will shake up how the views of the world. But so we have a question in the chat also from Rob Goldston, who asks that since House of Dynamite was mentioned, is it true, as far as you were able to determine, in the House of Dynamite, the scenario there was not anticipated in DoD planning? I don't know how you would have come across knowing that, but he asks, and so I'll pass that question on to you if anybody has an observation about it.
Well, I think, we did not get into these specific scenarios as part of our committee's work. One of the value, my personal take, having watched the movie the other night, it does raise some interesting questions, and you'd like to ensure that those questions are things that decision makers and their staffs look at and think about and are prepared to address in the event you have a scenario such as occurred. I won't give it away to those people that didn't see the movie, but I think the movie does highlight some things that need to be considered. One example is, what is the effective probability of a hit of an exo-atmospheric kill vehicle from a ground-based interceptor being launched against a missile coming from the Pacific? Missile Defense Agency has different tests and so forth. They can, in modeling simulation runs, they can provide decision makers with that background information to help assess the likelihood of shooting that incoming missile down.
Thank you. I see that Paul Slovic has raised his hand again. Paul, are you wanting to intervene here? We're not hearing Paul. Okay.
Okay, I got my audio's back. Okay,
Yeah,
thank you.
we can hear you, Paul. Yes.
Thanks for the great discussion. So I want to just build off of Stephen Young's pointing out the importance of focusing on the probability assessment and uncertainties. Again, to say, don't forget the consequences. The risk assessment has to be both a blend of probability and consequence. And I think we are woefully unable to assess the consequences. And let me just perhaps a comment for Jenny, if possible. I'd love to see the Academy work with interest Congress in supporting a study on how you improve the decision-making around the use of nuclear weapons, which I think is very problematic and is again highlighted in the movie House of Dynamite, where you see a bizarre kind of situation of unprepared president and so forth. So it would be great if that decision making could be brought into this whole arena. It needs to be. Thank you.
Paul, you're saying exactly what I was going to try to say, which is risk analysis is a tool that can and should be used by decision makers, but risk analysis itself doesn't make decisions. It helps guide decisions by decision makers, and those decision makers need to be aware of the risk analysis process for them to benefit from the outcome of it. So yes, and I will mention two other reports that are relevant to our discussion, and one is a recent one that was an assessment, approaches to how one would assess the environmental effects of a nuclear war, long-term effects of nuclear war, and another one that was earlier than our report, which gets to your point, Paul, just now, which is that the decision-making process in a nuclear war needs to be examined more, and that is a report on nuclear forensics, where we talked about the importance of leads of administrations actively understanding the progression of such a decision.
So thank you. So we have.
We'd like
please
to follow up. Paul has an excellent point. Two different decision makers, given the same risk analysis, might very well make very different decisions simply because each of them has a preference function, a risk attitude, and there is nothing that tells us that it's the same risk attitude. So there are two entirely different parts in the decision, the information and the preferences.
Thank you. So with that, let me ask a follow-on question, if I might, that looking at the way that you described the risk of strategic deterrence failure in terms of looking at the adversary, that seems to not consider the possibility that it would be meritorious to actually do analysis that looks at whether US action may actually trigger deterrence failure.
Mhm.
And so how does one think about that? I mean, is that a structural weakness in the way in which a risk of deterrence failure as an objective condition is considered?
I think I'll start off here and I'll ask Jenny and Elizabeth to chime in. I believe the ROSDEF process does look at, for instance, if the United States called off military exercises in South Korea, how might that activity being terminated or suspended impact actions by North Korea? Military exercises are often in times of peace one of the most visible indicators of U.S. presence and forward deployed status. And so I think those kinds of interactions can be considered under the existing ROSDEF process.
Okay, thank you. I was considering particularly the recent confusion about President Trump's statement about the United States resuming nuclear testing, for example, and where that may go in various ways, since that came out of no adversary at all, as far as one can see. But
I think you know, Zia, that point's been clarified
yeah,
last 24 hours by the Secretary of Energy.
I saw that. Yes, thank you. So we have time for two last questions, and there's one from several people asking about whether looking at risks of nuclear war, to what role did the committee look at the role of arms control, citizen action, and engagement as part of what feeds into the assessment of the risk of nuclear war?
I'd say that, STRATCOM in our time out there a little over 2 years ago now, does have that on their radar screen for, in particular, arms control agreements that were in place at that time between the United States and the Russian Federation. So I think that dynamic, and oftentimes the existence or not, or the extension or not of an arms control agreement, is an indicator of where relationships are in relations. Well, they move in a good direction or in a not so good direction. So I think, at least subjectively, but not quantitatively, the arms control arena is a factor that's considered.
Thank you. And one last question, and then I'll invite you all to make a brief closing remark. Since you mentioned that there is this issue about the Defense Threat Reduction Agency's nuclear weapon consequence models, and in the report you say that the consequence modelers at the Defense Threat Reduction Agency are in a wait and see mode to be able to address the gaps that you've outlined that are missing currently, such as the political, military, economic, social, information, and infrastructure impacts not being included. And so you mentioned that developing a metric for the inclusion of these effects in consequence models is difficult because no one has issued a requirement for it. Does the committee, or as co-chairs, do you have advice on what would be an appropriate approach to filling this gap in this requirement?
I think the committee discussed with DTRA the possibility of, let's just use the fires resulting from a nuclear explosion. That's just one concrete example that there could be analyses done to look more carefully at that physical effect of nuclear explosion. There are a lot of those capabilities that DTRA has, but have not yet been exercised. Our wait and see comments based on we need to see what leadership in the Department of Defense, elsewhere in the government, may or may not direct DTRA to do in response to whether it be our report or suggestions, recommendations by Congress.
Thank you. Elizabeth, Jenny, would you like to comment on that? And then I'll ask you all to make any brief concluding remarks that you wish.
Jenny.
Yeah, no, I think Bill answered the question really well, and that is, DTRA indicated to us that they had the capabilities to do more models, add more characteristics and more effects to their modeling, but they are restricted in guidance from the Department of Defense on what those are, and they're struggling, the Department of Defense, on what the metrics are that would drive that requirement. So it's sort of a bureaucratic Gordian knot, if you will, my interpretation of it. But yeah, I think any wider effort to encourage that this be done. And Zia, I know that you're working on it for the UN in terms of a wider consequence model for the nuclear war. So I think even that might be a good way of spurring action on this as well. So.
Okay, so thank you, Jenny. So let me just ask our three presenters if they wish to make any brief concluding remarks. And if we go in reverse order, Bill and then Elizabeth, and I'll give Jenny the final word. So Bill, please.
Yeah, no, thanks, Dean. I appreciate the opportunity. Appreciate the attendees today, your interest. These are important issues. And I think the fact that you're plugged into this for however long is a very positive sign. These are serious questions. Grave issues are on the table. And I applaud your commitment to trying to learn more and ask some thoughtful questions. The only other thing I'll say is that my colleague Elizabeth made some really great, I've learned a lot from her on probability, risk, consequences, and I think it's so important for decision makers to understand the gist of what Liz was saying. I'll leave it there.
Yeah. Thank you, Bill. Elizabeth,
Thank
please.
you, Bill. I would simply say that it's my observation, let's say in the last 10 years, that risk analysis is getting more and more used in the US government, where in fact, altogether, it's not very much used. But I've seen, for instance, a request for proposal from the Department of Defense that I thought was very promising. And in many different other places of the government, I see more risk analysis being used, and I think it's good news.
Yeah, thank you. So the last word to Jenny Heimberg. Jenny, please.
Thank you so much, and thank you for inviting us to come and talk about this. I will pick up where Elizabeth left off, and that is that it is such an encouraging sign to see the U.S. government interested in risk analysis and risk assessment instead of the absolutes of this must never happen. How do we make sure this never happens? And whether it's nuclear terrorism or pick your topic, understanding that those absolutes are not possible, but be able to develop policies in a risk-informed structure is at least lets us make some progress on those topics. So thank you again for inviting us, and I'm so glad that Paul joined, and I know that the committee is really was very devoted and worked really hard to make sure that this report was something that was accessible and useful. So thanks again for giving us an opportunity to talk about it.
So thank you all, and thank you for the work of the committee and the National Academies for helping educate all of us and to improve the democratic decision-making process as best we can contribute to it. So thank you all for all of your work. And you can find the recording of the webinar on the Physicists Coalition website, along with information about how to join and the links to the 3 reports from the committee that we've been hearing from. So thank you again, and until next time.
Thank you.